Greetings. Good afternoon, everyone. So wonderful to see you all here. My name is Wallace Best, and I'm serving as the interim director of the Center for African American Studies here at Princeton. And we at CAS are happy to have you join us for what we believe to be one of our most important recent initiatives, the Reflections on African American Studies annual lecture. The annual Reflections on African American Studies lecture provides opportunities for those of us who research, write, and teach in this area of study, as well as for the Princeton community at large to reflect on the current and future direction of the field. The aim of the series is to bring scholars who are thinking at the cutting edge of the discipline and who are taking up vexing questions about its past, current, and future trajectories. The lectures exemplify the role of the center as a model for African American studies in the 21st century. Reflections on African American studies could not be more fitting today as we commemorate the 45th anniversary of the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., when at approximately 6:01 p.m., as he stood on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, a sniper's bullet took his life away and quite possibly altered the history of our country. It is also the birthday of Maya Angelou, scholar, dancer, singer, activist, novelist, poet, and a few more other things you can describe Maya as. She turns 85. These two are among many others that continue to remind us just how important is the field of African American studies. They represent the substance of things hoped for and the evidence of things not yet seen. This year, on this notable day, we are most honored to have as our speaker a scholar of great renown and one of the leading figures in the field of African American studies, Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham. Her lecture today is entitled African American Studies and the Lessons of Experience. Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham is the Victor S. Thomas Professor of History and of African and African American Studies at Harvard University, where she is serving in her last year as the chair of the Department of African and African American Studies, having held that position since 2006. Prior to coming to Harvard in 1993, Professor Higginbotham was a member of the Department of History at the University of Pennsylvania. She has enjoyed many years as a teacher, beginning her career as a public school teacher in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and in Washington, D.C., before moving to the university setting. She has taught at Dartmouth College and the University of Maryland, as well as holding visiting professorships at New York University and here at Princeton in our own Department of Religion. At the special invitation of Duke University, she taught at the Duke Law School in the academic year 2010-2011 as the inaugural John Hope Franklin Professor of American Legal History. Professor Higginbotham has revised and rewritten the classic African American history survey From Slavery to Freedom, which was first published by John Hope Franklin in 1947, and is co-editor with Henry Louis Gates Jr. of the African American National Biography, a multi-volume work that presents African American history through the lives of more than 4,000 biographical entries. Professor Higginbotham is best known for her prize-winning book, Righteous Discontent, The Women's Movement in the Black Baptist Church, 1880 through 1920, a book of inestimable value to scholars across a wide spectrum of fields and disciplines. Most of us find that we return to Righteous Discontent year after year for its analysis and insights, and the insights it provides, such insights as, and I quote, "It was in the church more than in any other institution where Black women of all ages and classes found a site for signifying practice, for coming into their own voice." Professor Higginbotham is the recipient of numerous awards and honors, too many to name here, but of those most recently received, she was awarded the Star Family Prize for Excellence in Advising in May 2012 for her exemplary intellectual guidance and mentorship of Harvard undergraduate students. In 2012, she received the Living Legacy Award from the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. Dr. Higginbotham was inducted into the American Philosophical Society for promoting useful knowledge. The Association for the Study of African American Life and History awarded her the Carter G. Woodson Scholars Medallion in October 2008, and the Urban League awarded her the Legend Award in August 2008. In March 2005, AOL Black Voices included her among the top 10 Black women in higher education. And in April 2003, she was chosen by Harvard University to be a Walter Channing Cabot Fellow in recognition of her achievements and scholarly eminence in the field of history. She's a scholar extraordinaire, a warm and generous colleague, and a great friend. Please join me in welcoming Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham.
Well, thank you for that wonderful introduction. It's always a pleasure to come to Princeton. I don't think, been here in a while, but it's just wonderful to see old friends and colleagues. It's a pleasure. And I want to thank you, Wallace, for this invitation to talk to you about reflections on African American studies. As the chair of Harvard's Department of African and African American Studies, and as Wallace told you, this is my last year as chair, I speak to you tonight conscious of my own experiences in the early years of Black Studies on campus. Is that me doing this noise? I'm conscious of my own experiences in the early years of Black Studies on campus. I was a student at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee in the late 1960s and was very much a participant in the politically charged campus revolts of the time, and particularly the Black Power revolt that swept white and Black universities and elite schools and community colleges, as the recent book of Martha Biondi, The Black Revolution on Campus, so vividly portrays. And I was there to witness firsthand the academic institutionalization and incorporation of the field of African American studies. I was among those students who demanded a field of study on the Black experience. We used the word relevance quite a bit in those days in our calls for academic training that would serve us as individuals and prepare us to serve our communities. We were activists who believed in scholarship. We believed in education, the right education, that is. We often quoted Carter G. Woodson's The Miseducation of the Negro. We called ourselves Black nationalists, and we wore dashikis, and we were proud of our African heritage, which we learned about from reading the 1941 book of Melville Herskovitz, a white anthropologist, called The Myth of the Negro Past. So over these many years, I still remember and reflect upon this experience that has come to define African American studies. And I'd like to share with you the lessons that I have learned. First, I have come to realize that my generation, the 60s generation, was not the originators of this interdisciplinary field of study. And second, our ideas and experiences in regard to the nexus, the combination of scholarship and activism, were not new. And third, even the challenges to the intellectual legitimacy of our field, which we certainly faced in the 60s and continue to face. Those charges that we had displaced objectivity for propaganda. All of these criticisms were similar to criticisms leveled against our predecessors. So to my first point, the field of African American studies has a longer genealogy than most of us presume. And I'm not referring to the scholarly efforts outside the academy. I'm not referring to those, although they are evidence of a larger intellectual milieu of ever-growing interest in Black literature and history. In the racially charged atmosphere of the late 19th century, as Blacks faced mounting discrimination in the form of segregation and disfranchisement and violence, both lynching and racial riots. In that kind of atmosphere, they found much value in the celebration of their history and culture. And they did so in the refuge of their churches and schools and clubs and literary societies. Amateur historians, and here I'm thinking of someone as capable as George Washington Williams, provided sweeping and important accounts of Black life. In 1895, the Black reformer Victoria Earle Matthews lectured and wrote about race literature, that's what she called it. In the 1890s, Black club women, specifically the Alabama Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, led by Booker T. Washington's wife, Margaret Murray Washington, held essay contests among children to promote Black history. The American Negro Academy was founded in 1897 for the promotion of literature, science, and art. And in 1911, the Puerto Rican-born Arturo Schomburg, more familiarly known as Arthur Schomburg, helped to establish in New York City the Negro Society for Historical Research. And Schomburg spoke of the importance of collecting useful historical data relating to the Negro race. I am dating, however, the birth of the field of African American studies as we understand it today in the early decades of the 20th century, and specifically within the university context. Something new and important was happening in elite, top-tier universities and colleges of this nation that would contribute in a more direct way to the founding of this field that we have today. Little by little, Blacks had begun to receive the PhD, having been trained by eminent scholars credited with making significant changes in the American intellectual tradition. And here I'm thinking of W.E.B. Du Bois and Carter G. Woodson and Alain Locke, who received the PhD from Harvard. Du Bois in history in 1895, Woodson in history in 1912, and Alain Locke received his bachelor's degree in 1907 from Harvard. He went off to study at Oxford as the first Black Rhodes Scholar, and then he received his PhD in philosophy at Harvard in 1918. And they were joined by other Black scholars in succeeding years, scholars who received graduate school degrees from Columbia University, the University of Chicago, the University of Pennsylvania, and many other prestigious schools. Due to segregation, the Black scholars would go back to their communities to teach at the historically Black colleges and universities, and it would be there where they would write and publish and teach new generations of students. Now, those of us in the field of African American studies and the students who take our courses are familiar with the names and the works of the pioneers, Du Bois, Woodson, and Locke. We continue to read and discuss the intellectual issues and questions that concern them. Du Bois's annual Atlanta University conferences first fostered the idea that a multidisciplinary approach to social science was valuable to the study of African Americans. The Atlanta conferences featured each year a different topic. For example, the Black artisan, the church, the family, the college-trained, crime. And under university sponsorship, their findings were published as scientific investigations that would bring light to, and I quote, what they say, appalling problems before the educated men and women of the race that they and only they alone can and must handle. Now, Carter Woodson founded the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, as it was called then. It's now called the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. And he founded it in 1915. Its purpose was not narrowly historical. I want to emphasize the words life and history. in the group's title. In fact, the stated purpose at its founding was, and I quote, "the collection of sociological and historical data on the Negro, the study of peoples of African blood, the publishing of books in this field, and the promotion of harmony between the races by acquainting one with the achievements of the other." The philosopher Alan Locke, especially with the publication of the anthology The New Negro in 1925, brought together the findings of Black and white scholars from both the social sciences and the humanities. And Locke wrote that this new Negro type, quote, "welcomes the new scientific rather than the old sentimental interest." In rooting the interdisciplinary field of African American studies in the first 3 decades of the 20th century, I'm arguing that this field came to life and developed contemporaneously with transformations in the disciplines that began in American higher education in the late 19th century and continued throughout the 30s. And those transformations were monumental. They included new scientific methods and standards for research in the social sciences, modernist thinking in the human sciences, heralded a new epistemology, new cognitive perspectives that emphasized relativism and the fragmentation of the self. Progressive reform in education and pedagogy was set in motion as society itself became more secularized, more technological, more urban. And now we have several decades of scholarship on the emergence of modern social science. I think of the work of David Hollinger, Thomas Bender, Dorothy Ross, Robert Westbrook, and my own colleague, James Kloppenberg, just to name a few authors who talk about the importance of this transformation in the social sciences to new social scientific methodologies. And their scholarship attests to a lively debate on the meaning and consequences of the new methodologies and other changes in history, sociology, anthropology, political science, psychology, philosophy, and all this based on the writings of path-setting, groundbreaking personalities such as William Dunning in history, Franz Boas in anthropology, William James in psychology, William I. Thomas and Robert Park in sociology, and John Dewey in philosophy and education. And these are just a few of the names. These names are associated with schools of thought in American history, in cultural anthropology, pragmatism, urban sociology, and instrumentalism. The collective contributions of these individuals to their fields, as well as to other fields, ushered in a new intellectual authority. Sadly, however, Black scholars are rarely included in the histories of the rise of modern social science, and yet pioneering figures such as Du Bois and Whitson and Locke perceived their work to be part of this larger project, and it was. However, they also perceived their work as a critique and corrective of much of the work in the new social sciences. As graduate students and later as professors in segregated Black schools, colleges, and universities, the founders of African American studies benefited from direct contact with luminaries of progressive era reform in the academy. And these Black scholars read the works of these luminaries. They corresponded with them and collaborated with them. They had been taught by renowned thinkers such as Josiah Royce and George Santayana and William Channing and William James at Harvard and Robert Park at Chicago. And after his graduation from Harvard, Du Bois went to Germany, where he studied sociology with Max Weber. The work of Franz Boas, with its emphasis on cultural instead of inherent racial traits, was extremely influential to the thinking of Du Bois and Locke and Whitson. All of them met with Boas, and with Boas's student, Melville Herskovits. Also, activities outside the university facilitated scholarly networks. So in 1910, at the first meeting of the NAACP after it's incorporated. In the first meeting, Du Bois was present to hear John Dewey. John Dewey was also a founding participant of the NAACP, and he gave a speech on race reconciliation. Du Bois himself gave a speech. And the journalist and reformer and the NAACP leader, Mary White Ovington, discussed this initial gathering in the Journal of Negro History. And listen to what she says. She says, "It was amazing how little most of the white people knew. It was amazing how little most of the white people in the audience, interested as they were, understood the Negro problem. Every white person who came to the first conference of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was sympathetic, but most of them expected to meet belated people who would primarily arouse their pity. Instead, they met men and women who primarily aroused their admiration." That was Mary White Ovington. Although Carter Woodson is correctly called a race man and the father of Black history, it would be incorrect to think that white scholars played no role in the fulfillment of his goal to transform the historical profession, its scholarship and its curriculum and faculty. In fact, his revisionist goals for American history constituted a task of such magnitude that Woodson and his followers had no intention of creating a blacks-only endeavor. On the association's executive council in the formative years were the noted sociologist Robert Park of Chicago and Moorfield Story, a great civil rights lawyer who had been a former president of the American Bar Association, and he was the first president of the NAACP. However, nowhere are white contributors more present than in the Journal of Negro History. And for many years, this journal was the only periodical that published articles, documents, bibliographies, and book reviews on subjects related to the cultural life and historical experiences of Black Americans. And to a lesser extent, it also published on persons of African descent in South America, Europe, and Africa. Before the 1960s, the Journal of Negro History was one of very few periodicals in which the work of Black scholars could be published. Even for white historians, at least on any kind of regular basis, and even for white historians who worked on race-related topics, the Journal of Negro History and the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History's annual conferences offered opportunities to feature their work and to network across racial lines with thinkers with similar interests. John Hope Franklin would call the white scholars who took seriously the African American historical perspective intellectual kinsmen. So throughout the first half of the 20th century, Du Bois, Woodson, and the younger scholars committed to the study of African Americans, and some of these younger scholars would be Charles Wesley, Rayford Logan, Allison Davis, Charles S. Johnson, E. Franklin Frazier. All consistently used the word science and scientific method in regard to their scholarship. So when Woodson described the Journal of Negro History, he talked about it at its establishment as a quarterly scientific review. And more than this, the number of scholarly journals and university courses on African Americans and on race relations began to grow larger and larger in the 20s and the 30s, in the 1920s and 30s, so much so that a unique multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary field would become noticeable. By the mid-1940s, scholars actually began to use the term Afro-American studies. The early Black scholars, along with important white allies, also provided a counter-narrative, a counterpoint to much of this new social science scholarship. In The Origins of American Social Science by Dorothy Ross, Ross concludes that no matter the varied disciplines of these social scientists, because they came from many different disciplines, and she's talking about the white social scientists, and no matter the claims that they all made to being scientific and therefore above any type of bias. She argues that their writings were riddled with conservative presumptions of American exceptionalism. And by that she means that as these scholarly disciplines move from older traditions of religion and other types of romanticism as they write, as they become more scientific, they hold within them natural processes. That's what she's saying. They talk about natural processes as the explanatory basis for why American democracy was unique. You know, why American democracy was immune to the type of revolutionary and other social upheavals that had occurred in Europe. You find Max Weber writing about this and Dewey writing about this. And she argues that they posit a framework with which to help not only understand, but to control the new century's realities. She says that they influence values, they shape the language within which people understand the socio-historical world. Now, the founders of African American studies, now this time it's very embryonic in this early period, would probably not have agreed with Ross. They would have thought that her characterization was too broad because they did very much admire black scholars such as Boas or Dewey or James or Park. And so they wouldn't have agreed with her in putting all of them under this umbrella of indictment. But they would have agreed with Ross's conclusion in regard to the larger majority of these scholars. They weren't free of ideological bias when it came to matters of race. Their boasts of objectivity belied the reality that scientific theories, and I'm quoting Ross now, necessarily construct worldviews, and most often they are propagated as worldviews. So here's a few of the examples. I mean, one of the most influential and modern thinkers during this time period was a historian named Ulrich Phillips, who wrote a book called American Negro Slavery. And that book, at the time it came out in 1950, until it was surpassed by newer scholarship literally in the 1950s. So it came out in 1918. And it enjoys just a dominant interpretation well through the 1940s. But what does he argue? And he's praised for his rigorous analysis and statistical information, but he argues that slavery was and I quote him, training school for civilization. Or historians like William A. Dunning, and he's also a very important figure in this transformation of the social sciences. His book, Reconstruction, Political and Economic, which is published in 1907, portrayed a highly negative interpretation of the federal government's efforts to transform the South and the status of African Americans after the Civil War. His book enjoyed such a large and respected following that scholars in both history and in political science referred to his interpretation and its followers as the Dunning School. Now, in the first 3 decades of the 20th century, then, black scholars sought to be scientific at a very fundamental level. They had to provide evidence of the black experience. In an age when normative judgments in regard to race were increasingly argued on the basis of empirical evidence, the black scholar's goal was to correct the presumption that African Americans were inherently inferior and that they made no contribution to America. So their goal was to fill the gaps, break the silence, provide the outsider's perspective on American democracy, because theirs was the outsider's perspective of American democracy. And hopefully they wanted to instill pride in black people, 2 things, instill pride in black people and lessen racial prejudice in white people. And this is what Woodson writes. He said, "We should not learn less of George Washington, but we should learn something also of the 3,000 Negro soldiers of the American Revolution who helped to make the father of our country possible. We should not fail to appreciate the unusual contribution of Thomas Jefferson to freedom and democracy, but we should invite attention to one of his outstanding contemporaries, Benjamin Banneker, the mathematician and astronomer. We should not cease to pay tribute to Abraham Lincoln, but we should ascribe praise to the some 179,000 Negroes who had to be mustered into service of the Union before it could be preserved. The early Black scholars sought to do more than this, however. They wanted to do more than just fill the gaps. And this brings me to my second point, which is the nexus between scholarship and activism. Their professed belief in science was inextricably linked to the understanding that knowledge was a fight in the weapon against Jim Crow. And for them, knowledge was power. Rigorous research and methodology in the presentation of facts were not simply foundational, they were crucial to the struggle for racial equality. In 1936, Mary McLeod Bethune asserted that the research disseminated through the various organs of the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History appeared increasingly, and this is her words now, among scholars and students of racial progress all over the world. And for Bethune, as for many civil rights advocates, the knowledge of Black history and culture became the tool for Black advancement. For African Americans, scholarship itself was perceived not only as a means to foster Black pride and Black self-respect, but it was also seen as a means to diminish irrational prejudice. And this is what Bethune writes: by the strength of the facts, scholarship will open the eyes of many who have scorned or pitied us as a people without a past save that of savagery and slavery. And a rare testimony to Bethune's thinking occurred at this intersection of scholarship and activism in the whites-only teachers' college in Conway, Arkansas in 1932. Now, this is a segregated school. But it developed in 1932 an interdisciplinary plan of study. A report of the program notes that the purpose, and I quote it, was to create better understanding between the races, to acquaint white college students with the Negro as more than domestics or sharecroppers. The plan called for learning activities to be incorporated into the college courses. And again, I quote, if the Negro has made contributions as a musician, artist, or scientist, let the music, the art, and the science departments take cognizance of the facts and devote a proper proportion of study to them. So too with English, history, and other departments. And this is in 1932. Another aspect of this program was to send the white students, these future teachers, into the Black community to meet with contacts, teachers from Black schools. And then I quote again, for the working out of programs and projects where possible by the white children with the Negro children in their own schools, and on the other for activities designed to raise the standard of teaching and the certification of teachers. Now, this image of the scholar activist was familiar, especially in the academy during the 1930s, and it would be true for Blacks and whites, because especially in the 30s, labor studies and economic interpretations of historical events became quite prominent. And of course, this was a time of great economic crisis, the Great Depression. Jonathan Holloway has a wonderful collective biography of the sociologist E. Franklin Frazier, the political scientist Ralph Bunche, and the economist Abram Harris. And he reveals the influence of the left on their scholarship. And for these three men, Holloway tells us issues of class demanded an economic focus for thinking about tackling the race problem. But there were other perspectives, so scholars were also called upon to fight Jim Crow in the courts. And in its litigation against restrictive covenants, this is the housing situation where you can't move into a neighborhood because everybody has signed a contract that they're not going to sell to a Black person. So in those cases of restrictive covenants, and also in the cases of school desegregation in the 1940s and 50s, Thurgood Marshall and the NAACP turned to scholars from multiple disciplines to make their arguments. They turned to the white sociologist, Lewis Worth, to Black psychologist, Kenneth Clark, to John Hope Franklin, to C. Van Woodward, to the Swedish social scientist Gunnar Myrdal. John Hope Franklin believed that since white resistance to racial integration had marshaled social science in defense of its position, that civil rights advocacy must also deploy social science in its defense. And making an analogy to a much older and venerable tradition, Franklin posited, and I quote him, "When the patriots were fighting for independence, for American independence, the scholars came to the rescue of the polemicists and agitators, and Locke and Hume and Dickinson and Jefferson became household words among groups considerably larger than those who could be described as learned." But I want to emphasize to you that all this came at a price. It was one thing for social scientists to extol America's exceptional democracy, and quite another thing for social scientists to dare to call attention to the contradiction between our nation's ideals and practices. The work of the latter group was regularly deemed suspect and biased, less valid, less legitimate, a subject for study. Du Bois was outspoken in his rejection of the idea that scholars must pursue topics unrelated to their own racial context in order to achieve true objectivity. Because one of the arguments was that if you were a black person writing about black people, you just couldn't possibly be objective. And in 1944, when Du Bois was back at Atlanta University, and he is the editor of Phylon magazine, which is a peer-reviewed journal which he edited. The magazine was, or the periodical journal actually, was called Propagandistic. And he was very annoyed. Du Bois wrote, "No white academic journal would be evaluated in this way." And now I quote him, "Phylon serves a segregated cultural area. It is published by a university attended by Negro Americans and is very largely edited by persons of Negro descent. It is not and should not be interested solely in American Negroes. It should be interested in America and the modern world in all its studies, but logically, it should start from its own historical and social interest with the group and group cultures which it primarily represents." And then defiantly, he says, "Phylon, therefore, from the start, has deliberately begun its study of race and culture with conditions among the segregated group which it represents. It has offered and now offers no excuse for this." Well, throughout what had once been thought of as embryonic in terms of what is this thing that's pulling together, it became noticeable that African American studies were blossoming. The Journal of Negro Education, which is an additional now journal that's formed in the 1930s, began to collect statistics on the growing number of publications on African Americans, and even identified the libraries and repositories that house black collections. So when I was looking at the list, even Princeton is noted in that article for having items on slavery. The Journal of Negro Education is published out of Howard University. And also Howard pulled together in 1932, it launched a program, the Bureau of Educational Research, which began to catalog a national record, so it's all over the nation, of all master's theses and doctoral dissertations that dealt with black people or African Americans. It identified the authors of these dissertations, the race of these dissertations, the race of the authors, and in addition, information was provided as to the name and location, the racial character of the degree granting school. It's amazing when you read these things because there are so many white people from schools like the University of Iowa and places that are writing now about African Americans. Change was underway, and you can see it by the number of schools, because they break them down by white schools, by black schools, and by schools that do have an interracial student body. Change was underway, and it became noticeable because the scholarship grew in the 40s. In the 50s, the scholarship had grown so much that John Hope Franklin wrote an article called The New Negro History, and exponentially did it grow in the 60s. But well before the 60s, in fact, in 1945, Melville Herskovits wrote an article entitled Problem, Method, and Theory in Afro-American Studies. It was first printed in a periodical entitled Afro-American Studies. And in the following year, 1946, it's reprinted in Phylon. Now, reading Herskovits' article left me with little doubt that this field of study had finally come of age, at least in a conceptual way, if not, in an institutional way, because that won't happen for 2 decades and a Black Power revolt. But in many ways, this article, and I want to emphasize this to you, in many ways, this article represents a model closer to our own departments today than what my generation established or even envisioned in the late 1960s. Herskovits emphasizes that the uniqueness of the field is its interdisciplinarity, as well as its multi-regional character, focusing not only on North America, but on South America and Central America, the Caribbean, and Africa. It is precisely these qualities, according to Herskovits, that have made it difficult for the traditional academic disciplines to comprehend at times what we're all about. And yet, it is its interdisciplinarity and its global perspective that bring rich and novel frameworks for analysis. Herskovits asserts, and these are his words now, the implications of this interdisciplinary and intercontinental scope, when thought of in terms of the conventional organization of scholarly study, are many. For the field, he means Afro-American studies, for the field cuts across so many boundaries that it cannot be defined in terms of any commonly accepted categories, a fact that accounts for its late recognition as a definable area of scholarship. And then Herskovits explains this complexity further by saying that of necessity, the work that we do forces us to go into the social sciences, the humanities, and the biological sciences. And here he reveals a depth of understanding and a sophistication, real sophistication, in regard to what he calls this our field. He lays claim to a truly modernist intellectual tradition, and he reminds his readers that the same high standards of research are as relevant for our field as for any other scholarly field. Now, probably because of his anthropological perspective, his language captures the necessity, the demand, the requirement for Afro-American studies to have greater breadth and depth than would be the case of traditional disciplines. And in a long statement that takes us well beyond the first generation's evidence of experience, Herskovits urges a far more rigorous and challenging methodology, which actually seems to be a methodology of methodologies. I'd like to share that passage with you because it is the emphasis on the required obligations of scholarship to be interdisciplinary that reveals a process that would begin for a person in one discipline, and then because of the dictates of the study, the scholar would be forced to augment and enrich his research or her research with insights from other disciplines. Now, this is what he says. I quote him, "It is nonetheless worthwhile to recall how in Afro-American studies, investigation has had to have recourse to the resources of anthropology, history, and psychology to reach an understanding of the social structures, the accepted patterns of behavior, and the past development of the society's studies. How linguistics, musicology, and comparative literature have had to be called upon to contribute their techniques for insight into some of the most revealing data in the field, and how such problems as the incidence and effects of race crossing or the dynamics of Negro population formation have had to be studied in terms of the techniques and orientations of biology and demography. Not every student can study every problem, but most students of the Negro have come to realize that their competence in the discipline of their primary affiliation gives them but a starting point for further effort. The evolution of African American studies has much to teach us, so much so that I find myself in a back to the future mindset. I believe that our predecessors' efforts and their vision continue to speak to us today and to offer us a bit of guidance as we consider what our intellectual mission and pedagogy should be at the present time. And I also find myself remembering the 1960s demand for relevance, for relevant education. And once more, I think of Du Bois. I love Du Bois. I have to quote him to you. I could talk about Du Bois all the time. And this is what he writes in 1930. College teachers cannot follow the medieval tradition. Ooh. No, I don't want to answer the conference call. How do I get out of it? And we have an incoming call. How do we get out? Disconnect. Okay, it's okay. I did it. Okay, I have to start over now. So he says this about college teachers. Now, I would also say this about our students, but he's not. He's using the word teachers at this point. He says college teachers. So he's talking about us. Cannot follow the medieval tradition of detached withdrawal from the world. The teacher has got to be something more than a master of a branch of human knowledge. He has got to be able to impart his knowledge to human beings whose place in the world is today precarious and critical. And the possibilities and advancement of that human being in the world where he is to live and learn and make a living is of just as much importance in the teaching process as the content of the knowledge itself. Well, it was this kind of thinking in the 1930s and in the late 1960s that evokes the haunting memory of our call for relevant academic training, one that would enhance us as individuals while also preparing us to address the pressing needs of our community. And this is why I established, when I became chair in 2006, something called the Social Engagement Initiative. And social engagement is not a requirement, but it is an opportunity for our students to combine rigorous academic study with on-the-ground experience. And I'd just like to show you very briefly before I close some of what our students are doing. Social engagement is a transformative pedagogy. This is a photograph on the cover of a student that graduated last May in 2012. Her name is Nasima Muhammad. She read the work of Dewey and others who spoke about how important the arts can be as learning tools. And she went to her hometown in Bulawayo, Zimbabwe, and she worked together with artists, poets, and musicians and the teachers to get these students to think outside of the rote method that they had been using, to get the students to read books like Things Fall Apart by the late Chinua Achebe, and to reenact and to critically think about those messages in very creative ways. Nasima did two important things. One thing was that she got the teachers to have a newfound respect for her students, because their students, many of the teachers argued, just weren't excited about education. But it was difficult to be excited about education when 75% of the population was unemployed. So education certainly could not be used as an argument to get a job. So what Nasima had to do was to try to show them that education for education's sake is still of value. And the other thing that she did was, because she developed a new rapport with the faculty and the students, even with learning languages. The teachers would literally slap the kids if they spoke in their native language of Ndebele. And so she worked with the teachers to move beyond that. And corporal punishment has declined. And the Minister of Education has actually worked with Nasiba in trying to get more projects. And I'm really proud to tell you that Nasiba this December was named a Rhodes Scholar. And so she, like Evelyn Locke, joins a very illustrious group. Well, I'll just do this. So what is social engagement? It's academically informed civic responsibility. It's rigorous academic work, because you have to do all the traditional studying with on-the-ground experience. It's this on-the-ground experience that is so important, though, because it forces them to rethink what they're learning in class, to see if it's effective. Sometimes what they're learning in classes, the theories and concepts are challenged, even sometimes refuted by on-the-ground experience. It forces them to problem solve. And for those who write the thesis or the doctoral dissertation, it also develops in them a social entrepreneurship, that spirit where they come up with a project that demands innovative and collaborative work designed by themselves. This is one such student, Iman Taylor. She's the short one on the end. And she developed a project called Motor City Urban Summer Enrichment, MUSE. And she graduated last year in 2012. She wrote a wonderful thesis. In that thesis, she talks about the summer learning gap. And she looks at all the thinkers, including Jennifer Hochschild, who's on my own faculty. And she develops a program working with other students from Detroit. They create a 501c3, and they work with these students. This is one of the classrooms. The teachers call themselves coaches, and they teach them some of the subject matter that they learn in college. This is the class on the Harlem Renaissance. This is an example of one of our PhD students, Carla Martin, who wrote a dissertation which combines anthropology, linguistic anthropology, and music and history. And she is writing about a population of people from Cape Verde. And Cape Verde is on the this area right there, see Africa. But the population of the Cape Verdean population is even bigger in places outside. It's particularly big in the New England area. And one of the issues that she dealt with was the issue of official language, because the official language of the Cape Verdean people is Portuguese. And 2/3 of the people don't speak Portuguese, they speak Creole. And so in writing about that and in writing about all the ways to get resources into Creole, she is also trying to get that to be an official language. And this is Carla. She is the person on the end with Cape Verdean singers and other people who she brought to Harvard, and they met with people in the local community. This is Carla again with a book fair that she sponsored in Dorchester. And finally, her social entrepreneurial project was an online clearinghouse for Cape Verdean studies. She has brought together everything Cape Verdean so that people can use it and learn more in the language of Creole and about the culture of those people. And so I guess I'll just close by saying I hold to the old adage that experience is the best teacher. And it is, if we're mindful of its lessons. Thank you. So I'd love to take questions.
I was just going to say that.
Thank you so much for being here and for your presentation. And it's lovely to be in conversation with you. And I'm glad that you brought up Herskovits, obviously, for all sorts of reasons, but especially that moment where you referenced his reference to multi-regionalisms. And I was wondering if you might be able to talk a little bit about the ways that we can think through the history of Black studies as a story about a particular kind of Black intellectual regionalism, whether or not you think that's true, maybe I should ask, what it means to maybe think about the multiplicity of Black intellectual regionalisms in North America and how that's constituted a particular kind of trajectory in Black studies. Let me be transparent, I'm from California, and I've been 12 years in exile in New Jersey. So I'm really interested in that and whether or not we need to be having these kinds of conversations about the ways that the field has been constructed around a particular kind of regional identity.
But the field is changing. I mean,
It is,
I'll
right.
give you
This is,
a good...
I'm sorry, the other thing I want to ask you, though, is about the contemporary moment, right? And the ways that we can talk about, say, the rise of critical race, critical ethnic studies in California, for instance, versus certain kinds of discourses that are so dominant in the Northeast versus in the South. And I just think it's a rich conversation to have, and I want to thank you again because I think there's so much that you offered us today. So
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
And I'm going to stop talking now.
No, I appreciate those comments. And I mean, we are at a moment today, though, when scholars are addressing this. Like my favorite example, I teach a course called The Northern Side of the Civil Rights Movement. Now, when I first came to Penn, actually, I taught a course on civil rights movement. It was always about the South and Fannie Lou Hamer, and it was big just getting women into that story, okay? And then I teach now a course called The Northern Side, and it is a story that does just what you say, because you still have racial segregation. It's just not de jure, but you have racial segregation in the North. And during this time period, it's even in like the 30s and 40s and 50s, with housing, it's very difficult to open that up. And so there's struggles for that. There's struggles around schools. There's struggles about police brutality and riots, and there are all these struggles. But one of the things that's so fascinating is that the issues that are going on in New York are different from the issues that are going on in Philadelphia. And they're different from the issues that are going on in California. And why is that? Well, because in Philadelphia, the story has largely been told as a black-white story. In New York, the story used to be told as a black-white story, but I do have a student, Sonia Lee, who's written a book on, it's coming out in, if it's not out already, on the Black Puerto Rican issue, the blacks and Puerto Ricans. And so the Puerto Rican issue adds a whole dimension to the black-white story, let's say, that Martha Biondi writes about in her book on New York. But then, if you go out to California, you have people like Scott Kurshiga, who's a historian, who brings the Japanese into the story, and Mexicans, or people like Robert Self, who has a very, sophisticated story of a variety of distinctions, even within the black community itself, from people who are coming from the South and all that. So I do think we are far more attentive to the complexities. In fact, if you look at the early scholars, the Woodsons and everyone in that first generation, one of the criticisms is that they are so monolithic in the way they talk about black people. But they were just discovering, the information. Yes.
Thanks so much, Evelyn. That was so helpful. I want to pick up part of what Daphne was saying. As you were talking, we belong to the same generation, so the 60s stuff, and then so much of that 60s stuff sounds current today, and so much of what you brought up about the early 20th century sounds current today.
Mm-hmm.
You didn't cite John Hope Franklin's 1947 article about what the Negro scholar teaches history, but that was obviously in what you were saying. It's so current, all those old things. But on the other hand, picking up on what Daphne had to ask about where we are now and what's different. You talked about Puerto Ricans. I'm from California too, so the different ethnicities.
Hispanic, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if that sort of totalizing, essentializing 20th century view of the Negro and then the diaspora, which kind of collapses people of African descent, no matter where they are, into the Negro. If that no longer serves in the same way, if we need to sort of throw over diaspora, I'm overstating here, throw over diaspora and look at micro areas or regions, respecting all those differences.
Well, it is interesting to see this new concept of the global South and the way that's operating now. I mean, that is inclusive of people we think of in our diaspora, but it's also inclusive of other people who we don't think of in our diaspora. But when we think of diaspora, I understand that term to mean a recognition that people of African descent are in a lot of places in the world. And I don't presume that that term means simply that they're all alike, but it does mean that they're in places all over the world. It may mean that they have suffered forms of oppression like colonialism and racism that can be compared. You know, it may mean that they have really interesting differences in religious viewpoints, you know, that put Black people with one religious viewpoint in real conflict with Black people in another religious viewpoint. I mean, we see that within Africa. So obviously, you know, you can see it across the regions themselves. At the same time, diaspora allows for not only a multi-regional perspective, but a transnational perspective, where we begin to look at, for example, music. Hip-hop is global, and it is global addressing its own indigenous places. I mean, in Senegal, it's got its own voice. It's not, you know, what we're hearing in Brooklyn, but there's still similarities. And how those, especially music and culture, arts and seem to be such universalizing mediums to me. They, I remember reading, and I think it was Penny Von Eschen. This is actually a black-white issue, but she was talking about Louis Armstrong, Satchmo, and he was in West Germany, and he wanted to get over to East Germany, and the guards were saying, oh, there's no way, no American can get over there. Well, he got over there and did a jam session over there, got back over. So there's something that's going on universally in terms of the appreciation, but then there's politics attached to that too, because these people are, you know, ambassadors of America during the Cold War, so ambassadors with quotes around, during the Cold War. So they're doing the work of something else, much like the recent issue about the basketball player in Korea. Why am I blanking on his name? Dennis Rodman, yeah. So the story is just more complicated. I mean, I think one of the reasons I said that I thought on some levels Herskovits describes a complexity that we acknowledge today that I don't think any of us in the 1960s perceived that same kind of complexity, is because he looks for so much detail based on his own interests. He's interested in trying to find what is of African heritage in the cultures of the New World. You know, now that has its own problems on some levels, but it also has a fascinating way of trying to understand acculturation. You know, how do people form cultures? And I didn't use this in the paper, but I use this in From Slavery to Freedom. When Herskovits in the 1940s, when there's all this debate about how to portray Black people because we're fighting for civil rights, and at this point, it's reminiscent of Darrell Scott's book, Contempt and Pity, there becomes a shift where you do have a lot of social science work that sounds very different from Carter Woodson's. And this social science one is the damage theory approach, that we've got a lot of crime in our community, we've got a lot of dysfunction in our community. And the argument for writing like that I mean, one, I think sociologists tend to write more like that than historians do. But the other argument for writing like that is that the NAACP lawyers can then say, it is the environment that creates this segregated environment. So in the midst of all this, here comes Melville Herskovits. And Melville Herskovits writes in Myth of the Negro Past, and I don't have the quote exactly, but it's something like this. Well, what if the black people in America finally find out that they have a culture that they should be proud of? You know, and what if the black people in America find out that instead of not having anything, that actually their music and their art is so developed that it's transformed even what we think of as America? And what if, you know, when you find all this stuff out about your African heritage, in the end, you take up a pride? Doesn't that do something for this struggle that we're involved in? So he writes this. Now, when he writes this, the white sociologist Guy Johnson and even Ellen Locke, they read this and people are horrified. They're looking at this and they're saying, oh my goodness, you know, we are fighting for integration. And while we know you're a good scholar, Melville, what we find problematic is that some people will read what you're saying and think black people aren't able to be assimilated. Well, what I find so fascinating about the what if question is that is the question we answered in the 60s. Because in the 60s, we were taking up his call. We were saying, yes, we do have a culture that's different. Yes, we do have a consciousness even that's different. You know, and then as scholars of history, as scholars of religion, we began to transform the way slavery studies were done. No longer were we white men in black skins, as Kenneth Stamp said, but we were a slave community that had its own understanding of religion, slave religion, you know, had its own ways of even interpreting biblical narratives such as Exodus. You know, that was Al's book is, you know, still the classic. So there was just so much going on. We have cycles, I think, of, you know, how we do things. But we are in a complexity cycle now. At Harvard, we've just hired a man who's going to be our Afro-Latin Americanist, you know. And so the idea of bringing an Afro-Latin Americanist is not to say we're all the same. It's to say, actually, we are really quite different, and that other identity needs to be, you know, addressed. And yes. Oh.
Where would you put Zora Neale Hurston in your history of intellectual development? She's a hero of mine, and I don't think she was a scholar. She was an activist. She was
Boaz's student.
She was, and she was a student of Boaz. Yeah. Anyhow, your thoughts?
She was a very complicated person.
I know. She's
Okay,
great.
I have a very difficult time calling her my hero. I mean, I understand why people like her as a feminist, but she is truly a complicated woman. She opposes the Brown v. Board, you know, yeah. So, you know, some of those things are sticky. She, I just hate to even bring this up, but there's a woman named Carla Kaplan who's edited the letters of her. Okay. So she's writing to Carter G. Woodson. This is in the 20s, and he's literally giving her money from the association to do this work. She has articles in the journal, one of which is plagiarized, it's been found out. But the other that she does, you know, she writes back, oh, Dr. Woodson, you know, this is wonderful, you just gave me all this money to go down to Florida and look for the cultures there. And she is clearly out of the Boazian Herskovits tradition, because she really doesn't see, you know, cultures in any kind of hierarchy. She likes, you know, if it's the Negro church in its most, I hate to say it, but primitive form, she'd much rather see that than it messed up with, you know, high culture. Okay, so that's all fine. But then what she does, because I read this stuff so carefully, she writes to Franz Boas And she says to him, you know, Papa, because she calls him Papa Franz, I was in, I think it was South Carolina, and Dr. Woodson was down here, and he was talking about Negro history, and he was, you know, he got the people all riled up about, you gotta have pride, and you gotta have, and she said, I had to leave the room. I mean, it was just sickening. Now, that's the kind of stuff, it is difficult for me to make her a heroine when I see those kind of ambiguities in her. But she clearly was a talented person, and she clearly was the subject of much admiration by a lot of people. But I will also say this, and this is in fairness to her. These scholars of whom I talk about, they, on a personal level, are so much more complicated, and they don't like each other. So Du Bois does not like Woodson. You know, Herskovits undermines both Woodson and Du Bois in getting foundation money. So if you got just hung up on their personalities and their internal squabblings, you could easily come away with the idea that this is really a mess. But they're human beings, and what I always tell people when they get off on this tangent is, we remember them for their intellectual legacy. See, and their intellectual legacy just leaves all this other stuff behind. But it is fascinating. I mean, when you read Du Bois's comments when Woodson dies in 1950, and he said something like, well, this was an unhappy man. He starts off like, this was an unhappy man. And he's just, you know, mean-spirited. You wonder, like, whoa, where did that come from? But their intellectual legacy, that's what we teach. Other questions?
Yes, thank you. I'm enjoying your lecture very much.
Thank you.
Michelle Alexander,
Mm-hmm.
the new Jim Crow.
Mm-hmm.
Should African American student groups give a high priority to doing what she suggests, and that is participate in a social movement
Mm-hmm.
to reduce or eliminate massive incarceration,
Mm-hmm.
and that would also, of course, mean an emphasis on education and all
Mm-hmm.
the other areas
Mm-hmm.
related to that.
Mm-hmm. No, I think they should, but I will say, I think on some levels, not enough, but on some levels you are seeing these kind of things addressed. You have the preventive groups. So, for example, I spoke just last Saturday at a group called the Du Bois Society, and it has young men and women in it. And it's a group that works with kids at the high school age, and like junior high, high school age, to get them interested in intellectual issues. And so professors come and, you know, we talk about something that they'd be interested in. Like I talked about the era of the Booker T. Washington, Du Bois, you know, debate. And, you know, so that's one way, just preventive, to get people's minds off of this. Because one of the big arguments about the pipeline from the schools to the prisons is a real one. But then you also have, in law schools, clinics. I became really aware of this when I was at the Duke University Law School. You have these law clinics, which are very good because they do work with juvenile issues. That is one of the themes of some of the clinics, about juvenile offenders and how to have better and more equal sentencing. So this is, yes, a huge problem, and it's a problem that we have to solve. Any others? Yes. Oh, sorry, and then I'll get to you, yes. Oh, okay, go on.
Okay, thank you. Professor Higginbotham, I really loved and wanted to hear more about the transformative pedagogy that you talked about.
I can hear you.
The transformative pedagogy.
The transformative pedagogies, yes,
towards
yes.
the end, and you talked about social engagement, and I'm really interested in you talking a little bit more about that, particularly in terms of the scholarly analysis that goes along with that. I think so often when we think about social engagement and social entrepreneurship,
It doesn't have it.
you don't see that component. And I think more and more as we think about our curriculum going forward, how do we capture that social entrepreneurship entrepreneurship, as well as the scholarly analysis that needs to be done so that it's transformative pedagogically.
Okay, so you mean the current transformative, not the older. Okay. So yes, so in, one of the things that I realized, I look at somebody like my late husband. My late husband was a federal judge, Leon Higginbotham. And one of the things that was so wonderful about Leon is that he was a very intelligent man. He was a very scholarly man. But he was able to use his knowledge of the law in all kinds of pro bono ways as a lawyer to do, social good. So, for example, he worked on a case for the Congressional Black Caucus over voting rights. He worked with Nelson Mandela and the Constitution. So, Leon, in many ways, is my model, because what I said to my students is that we have programs, we have a lot of service programs. And so you have people who have bifurcated lives. On the one hand, they do work, that's the real job, and then they do this other stuff on the side. Well, what if you could combine those two things? What if the knowledge that you're actually using, because that's what Leon used, he used the knowledge that he actually learned in schools and from reading to do these things. So my idea was to get our students to take courses. We call them social engagement courses. So just let me give you one example. We had a course called Global Health Disparities in our own neighborhoods. Now, why call it global health disparities? For one reason, because we have all these different ethnic groups in our neighborhoods. So the professor was a medical anthropologist, and so she had them reading all of the traditional anthropological studies and things that they would do in a traditional class. They had to take the test, they had to do all that stuff. But there was an added aspect to the class. And what she did with the class is she broke them down into 5 components by the Ethiopian population, the Haitian Creole population, the Sudanese, and so we got these different groups. Then we brought in our African language instructors. So our African language instructors became the ambassadors to those communities for our students. And so they would take those groups of students into those communities, and the students had to learn some of the language and be very sensitive to the cultural protocols of those societies. And then the students had to realize, I'll give you the Haitian example, for example. The group studied the prevalence of diabetes in the Haitian community. And so doctors are saying to them, well, you got to stop eating all this white rice. You got to stop eating all this, But it's like Herskovitz says, they had to then go to history and to the culture of these people. And this is so much a part of their history that you can't just say, stop eating sugar and it's going to end. Nor can you tell them to eat barley or millet and this other stuff, because this is the food that they give to animals. And so if you have a food that's given to animals and you already have a culture that is dealing with issues of poverty, when they come to this country, in their minds, white rice is what you eat. So there's a real need to engage so many levels of understanding, So that's one example. But I mean, I have tons of examples. I had a student, I didn't show him up there, he brought fresh water to a village in Ghana called Ajamanti. And he had to learn public health issues, the history of that Ghanaian community and of Ghana, speaking the language. I mean, there was just so many complicated things. When they then got to the point of building latrines, he had to try to figure out why the geological structure wasn't permitting the kind of cost-efficient latrine that they wanted. So each step made his process more. He won a Hoops Prize. That's a great prize. He won the Hoops Prize for his thesis. That was our first social engagement thesis. You had one question? Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. They're not kicking us out.
Yeah.
I really appreciate your talk and
Thank
sort
you.
of this unveiling of intellectual history, especially how, these scholars, which most of us are familiar with, but critiqued the prevailing normative, theories of the time.
Mm-hmm.
even as those were undergoing a revolution in itself, because I'm in sort of this global history field myself, and I've understood that Atlantic Studies and Eric Williams and Oliver Cox and Cedric Robinson and Sidney Mintz and these were the people who pushed beyond boundaries because of the questions that they had.
Exactly.
And then that led into historical social scientists to rethink European history and all of these things. So that's another sort of unveiling that now has been sort of wiped clean. Nobody realizes those linkages. But I want to ask you, given that the embryonic field, rise of the field had that as part of their mission, right? Part of their mission was to critique the scholarly notions of the day, including American exceptionalism. What would those notions be today that the field in the future should be oriented towards, not just debunking, but critiquing, displacing? Is it still American exceptionalism
It is
in a
still
way?
American
but
exceptionalism.
also, what else do you think?
It is definitely still American exceptionalism, and it is still an issue of trying to understand a very pluralistic nation. Locke, in 1918, was writing about pluralism, and Horace Callan, who was, I think, his teaching fellow at Harvard, had also, and it was over in Oxford, was writing about pluralism. But this is still an issue that we cannot get our hands clearly on yet, that we have a very diverse population, and yet the access of groups is quite uneven, you know. And the other thing that we can't, I think, get a handle on right now is what are the rights of citizens in terms of their expectations of social goods, you know. Should a citizen believe that health is a fundamental human right? Well, you know, Truman said this years ago, so, and we're still debating it. So I think there's still a lot that gets taught in political science and gets taught in history departments, and the disconnect between the real world and what we learn in our classes is also quite appalling. You know, we say, how could people think like that? So that's really something we need to figure out. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank Professor Higginbotham once again. Thank you, Evelyn, very much. Thank you. I'd like to thank you all once again for coming to our second annual Reflections on African American Studies lecture. Thank you, Evelyn, so much for your words of experience and your words of knowledge, and you've given us a lot to think about, and we will do so. We promise we will do that.